It was December of the year 1944. The trees in the Ardennes stood like skeletal silhouettes beneath a sky weighed down by snow. The wind was sharp and cold, pushing the falling flakes sideways across the forest floor. Beneath a camouflage net, inside a frozen M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson watched through a fogged periscope. His breath came in shallow bursts. His gloved hands trembled, not from fear, but from the bitter cold that seeped through every inch of metal and bone. Just 800 yards away, a line of German tanks snaked its way through the woods. There were 12 of them, Panzer IV models mostly, and one Tiger one at the front. Behind them, half-tracks rolled with infantry and fuel trucks brought up the rear. They were heading toward a vital crossroad, a road that, if taken, would cut off supplies and reinforcements to the 1001st Airborne Division, currently encircled in Bastogne. Thompson had no orders, no permission to fire. He was told to wait, to observe, and to report. But he could see what was about to happen. So he made a decision. Without a single command, without clearance, Ray Thompson pulled the trigger, and everything changed. The rules of engagement. 3 days earlier, inside a drafty farmhouse near the Belgian front, Ray Thompson sat hunched over a cold metal desk as his commanding officer briefed the crew of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion. "No one fires without confirmation from command," the officer said flatly. "I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they are. We do not give away our position unless ordered." The room was quiet. The men nodded. But there was tension beneath the surface. Everyone knew the enemy was moving and fast. Outside, the Battle of the Bulge was just beginning. On December 16th, under cover of fog and snow, the German army had launched its last major offensive. On the Western Front, it was called Operation Watch on the Rhine. The goal was simple: split the Allied line in two, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. They hit with over 200,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, an absolute surprise. American lines buckled. Some units vanished overnight. Friendly positions changed by the hour. And in the confusion, many commanders feared the worst enemy might not be in front, but friendly fire from behind. So the rule was clear: wait for orders. For Thompson, that meant observation duty. He and his 3-man crew were dug into a ridge near a forest road north of Nevers, a crossroads town just outside Bastogne. They had good cover, ample range, and an icy view of the valley below, but no permission to engage. Day and night, Thompson scanned the terrain. Through his frosted scope, he marked tank tracks, counted pines stripped by treads, and sketched enemy movements in a notebook his mother had mailed him months ago. He logged everything: range, bearing, wind speed, but he didn't fire. Once he had tracked a lone Panzer creeping near a ravine for nearly an hour. No orders came. It passed. The anger inside him burned, but the discipline held. He knew what his job was. He knew the cost of a wrong shot. One wrong shell could mean a dozen dead Americans or a revealed position that brought down an entire German battery in return. But as the hours dragged on and more enemy traffic moved through the trees, the question changed. Was holding fire really the safer option? Thompson wasn't reckless. He was precise. He studied German columns like a mathematician studies patterns. He knew how they moved, how they stacked vehicles for support, how they relied on tight formations. And more importantly, he knew where to hit them, if and when the time ever came. He just didn't know yet that he would be the one to decide it. Who was Ray Thompson? Raymond Charles Thompson was not born a soldier. He grew up in the vast, flat nothingness of western Kansas, where winter wind could peel the paint off a barn and summer heat baked the wheat fields until they cracked open like overcooked bread. His father Charles ran a small engine repair shop in town. His mother, Anna, taught 7th grade math at the local school. Ray grew up surrounded by gears, grease, and graph paper. Even as a boy, he saw the world through angles. He could tell you exactly how far a grain silo was by the length of its shadow. When most kids played with slingshots, Ray was building one with a pulley system and counterweights, trying to see how far he could launch a pebble with pure precision. He didn't join the army because he was itching for a fight. He enlisted in 1942. because he wanted to study engineering, and the army offered him training, pay, and a future. He got the training. The pay wasn't much. The future that depended on surviving Europe. By the time Thompson arrived in Normandy, he was 22 years old and already looked 5 years older. His first combat experience came in the hedge, where the enemy could be 10 feet away and you wouldn't know until they were firing. He watched a friend, Jimmy Delgado, burn alive when a Panzer's shell caught their half-track in a roadside ditch. Another, Frank Murray, was vaporized by a mine outside St. Lo. Thompson stopped believing in luck after that, or orders, or safe distances. He started believing in patterns, routines. He studied how tanks moved, where they paused, how long it took for a turret to rotate. He started carrying a small spiral notebook in his jacket. Every German vehicle he encountered, he'd sketch it, note the vulnerabilities, the blind spots. He didn't talk much. Other soldiers called him the quiet clock because when he did speak, it was short, direct, and usually timed down to the second. But when it came to gunnery, he was deadly. Not flashy, not fast, just accurate, predictable, in the best possible way. In the Army's view, he was a good gunner, disciplined, smart, calm, under fire. What they didn't realize, what even his closest crewmates didn't fully see, was that Ray Thompson was also a thinker, a tactician, not just a trigger puller, but a man who could see a battlefield like a chessboard, and in 3 days' time, that quiet cons with the angle-obsessed brain would rewrite the rules of engagement in a single burst of firepower, because sometimes war doesn't reward those who follow instructions. It rewards the ones who understand when to break them. What he was up against. On the morning of December 19, 1944, the fog lay thick and low across the Ardennes. It clung to the branches like smoke. Vision was limited. Sound was distorted. But through his periscope, Ray Thompson saw them. First, the silhouette of a Tiger, one tank. The unmistakable beast with its long barrel and snarling square shoulders. Then another, and another. The German column was moving through the forest road like a steel serpent. 12 vehicles, maybe more. It was a textbook armored assault column, clean, tight, disciplined. At the front, the Tiger led like a battering ram, capable of punching through nearly anything the Americans had. Behind it came 3 Panzer IV tanks, each fast, efficient, deadly. Then came to half-tracks, filled with infantry. Behind them, support vehicles, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, field kitchens. Even the tail end of the column was flanked by a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, a sign they were expecting contact and prepared for anything. Anything except one unapproved American gunner with a Wolverine. The road they were on was narrow, barely wider than the column itself. Steep forest banks on either side. Thick trees hemming them in. No room to maneuver. No room to scatter. To Thompson, it wasn't just a road. It was a trap. But here's the catch. Ray had no orders. No one else could see what he saw. Radio contact with his battalion's forward HQ was weak, garbled, or non-existent. The only way to reach command was to reposition and risk exposure. By protocol, he was supposed to observe the enemy, report their heading, let air support or artillery take the lead. But Thompson wasn't watching a column in transit. He was watching a blade aimed straight at the throat of the American line. That road, the one they were creeping down, led directly to the Noval crossroads. If they took Noval, they'd flank the defenders at Bastogne from the north. The 101st Airborne Division, already encircled, would lose its last major supply lifeline. The result would be catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Americans cut off in the cold. And yet the tanks kept moving forward, calm, confident, protected by the belief that American forces were disorganized, scared, and stretched too thin to respond. They were half right. Ray Thompson was scared. He was cold. He was isolated. But he wasn't disorganized. He was calculating. He knew that if he fired too early, they'd scatter. If he hit the wrong target, the others might escape or return fire with overwhelming force. But if he fired with precision, just the right vehicles in the right order, he could do something most officers would say was impossible. He could dismantle an entire armored column piece by piece. And he'd have to do it without a word from command. Without backup, without permission. He licked his lips, reached for the elevation dial, took one last look at the formation, and waited for the moment no manual had prepared him for. The unauthorized pattern begins. Ray Thompson had never fired without orders. Not once, not in training, not in France. Not even when his instincts told him to pull the trigger days earlier. As a lone Panzer crossed his scope, but now, staring at a perfectly exposed German armored column, crawling forward like clockwork, he realized something. Waiting was no longer caution. Waiting was suicide. And so, with no radio contact, no green light, and no one to back him up, readjusted the angle, held his breath, and fired. But he didn't aim for the lead tank. He aimed for the third. The armor-piercing round left the barrel of the M10 Wolverine with a thunderous roar that shattered the quiet and kicked a wave of snow into the air. It struck the third Panzer for directly in the flank. The explosion sent a shockwave through the trees. A plume of fire and black smoke erupted into the fog. Metal screamed. The entire column halted, but Thompson wasn't done. As his loader rammed in the next shell, Thompson shifted position slightly, 5 yards to the left. Enough to throw off any German gunners scanning for muzzle flash. Then he fired again, this time at the sixth vehicle. The blast ripped through the half-track carrying infantry. Its fuel tank ignited instantly. Bodies were thrown into the trees. The fire spread to the dry underbrush, lighting the forest floor in patches of orange and black. The Germans were no longer halted. They were panicking. The Tiger at the front tried to reverse, but the column was packed too tightly. The crew inside the Tiger shouted and gestured furiously, trying to clear a path. But behind them, the rest of the formation was now bottlenecked, blinded, burning, boxed in. Thompson reloaded again. His crew, now fully alert, and realizing what was happening, didn't question him. They followed his lead. He fired the eighth vehicle, a fuel truck. The result was instant and biblical. The explosion rocked the hillside, flames jetting skyward like a volcanic blast. The force knocked a nearby infantryman to the ground. The fireball backlit the tank silhouettes like ghostly shadows. From a distance, it sounded like a full artillery ambush. In reality, it was one man, one gun, and a gut feeling. But the order of his shots wasn't random. Thompson had spent months studying German doctrine. He knew their reliance on tight formations, knew the logic behind their placement. Fuel and support in the rear, armor in front, infantry in the middle. By taking out the third vehicle, he created a physical block. By hitting the sixth, he jammed the middle. The eighth fuel crippled their retreat and ignited chaos. It was a chain reaction firing pattern, a surgical disruption of German tactical structure. Each shot was a scalpel, not a hammer. The Germans, now confused and cut off, began firing wildly into the trees. Their machine gunners riddled snowbanks and empty trunks. Infantrymen ducked behind flaming wrecks, unsure of where the fire was coming from. To them, it felt like a trap. An orchestrated ambush by an entire battery of American tank destroyers. But there was no ambush. There was no battery. Just Ray Thompson and a crew who had stopped asking questions. As the enemy scrambled, Thompson moved again, using the forest terrain like a sniper. He knew how to use angles. Knew how far his gun could reach without revealing too much. Every new position was chosen for cover, for elevation, for maximum confusion. He wasn't just shooting, he was dismantling. And each blast was another page torn from the German field manual. Destruction in the woods. The Ardennes had gone silent just moments before the first shell. Now it screamed. Trees cracked and fell under shockwaves. Snow, fire, and shrapnel filled the air like confetti from a hellish celebration. Thompson's third shot had set off a fuel truck. The fourth struck a half-track that had tried to reverse. Its wheels were already spinning in the icy mud when the shell hit, sending the chassis skyward in a twisted arc of steel. The German Tiger at the front was stuck. The crew tried desperately to reverse, but they were trapped between flaming wreckage and vehicles behind that. Couldn't move without ramming each other. Their tight, disciplined formation, so effective in open terrain, had become a steel coffin inside the forest road. From Thompson's vantage point, everything moved in slow motion. He saw soldiers yelling, arms waving, confusion turning to panic. German infantry began to scatter into the woods, abandoning vehicles. Some took cover behind trees. Others sprinted into the snow, stumbling and slipping on frozen roots. One officer climbed on top of a tank to get a better view and was cut down by a burst of Thompson's coaxial 50 caliber machine gun. The crew inside the M10 was sweating now, not from fear, but from sheer physical exertion. The loader's hands were blistered. The assistant gunner's voice was hoarse from yelling coordinates. The tank smelled like grease, hot metal, and cordite. But Ray Thompson was ice-focused. Every shot he took came from calculation. Not adrenaline, not rage, just pure practiced mathematics. He was repositioning after every 2 shells. Not far, 10 yards here, 20 there. But enough to make German gunners doubt their aim. Smoke helped. Fog helped. The terrain helped. But the real advantage, they thought there were more of him. The Germans believed they had stumbled into a multi-unit ambush. Some guessed for tanks, others said 8. There were even reports of American artillery batteries in the hills, though no such batteries existed in that sector. The truth, it was one M10 tank, destroyer with a 3-man crew and a gunner who was supposed to be following orders. By the 30-minute mark, the road was clogged with burning steel. At least 5 vehicles were destroyed. Another 3 were immobilized. Survivors from the rear fuel and support crews had already turned and run back down the forest trail. The Tiger finally managed to pivot its turret, rotating toward the ridge where Thompson had fired last. Thompson didn't flinch. He waited. He knew the Tiger's armor was thickest in front, but weakest on the sides. And if you knew the exact moment when it turned, when the hull exposed just a sliver of its flank during repositioning, that was your window. The 5th shell left the barrel and struck home. A bright hot flash tore through the Tiger's side. For a second, it held. Then, the internal ammunition cooked off. The entire turret launched upward in a plume of fire, landing several yards away. The blast was so violent it knocked the German anti-gun in the rear off balance. Its gunners, stunned, dropped their weapons and ran into the trees. Smoke now poured into the forest like lowlying clouds. The wreckage glowed beneath the gray morning light, and the road that had once been a pipeline of armored strength was now a burning bottleneck of destruction. One of Thompson's crewmen looked at him and said, "Are we still going to get court-martialed for this?" Thompson didn't answer. He just loaded another round. The job wasn't finished. The German view a ghost battery. Hours later, under interrogation in a makeshift American holding tent, a captured German lieutenant, his face smudged with ash, coat half-burned, eyes glassy with shock, struggled to find the words. He spoke in fits, stammered, paused. "There were many guns," he said in broken English. "Maybe 6, maybe more. We were attacked by a full battery, American intelligence." Officers exchanged glances. There hadn't been a battery. There hadn't even been a full unit. There was just one M10. Wolverine and a gunner, who officially had never been given permission to fire. Other German prisoners described it differently. Some said it was an ambush laid by paratroopers with anti-tank weapons. Others claimed the Americans had planted mines and booby traps. Evidence of sabotage, not gunnery. One man, barely 20, swore he saw muzzle flashes from 3 different angles. But the flash pattern had come from one source: Thompson, who had moved after every shot. In their confusion, the Germans had begun to invent enemies that didn't exist. Fear filled in the blanks. Even seasoned tank commanders reported seeing American armor silhouettes deeper in the trees. In the chaos of burning wrecks, smoke, and disintegrating command chains, they imagined what they couldn't identify. It wasn't cowardice. It was psychology. They simply couldn't believe one man had done that. To them, it was impossible that a single tank destroyer could have struck with such timing, such precision, and such devastating effect. And in a way, they were right. This hadn't been brute force. This had been surgical disruption. Thompson's decision to fire at specific targets, 3rd, 6th, and 8th vehicles, followed a logic no German unit had prepared for. German doctrine taught that American forces were slow to respond, overly reliant on orders from above. The assumption was that Americans were efficient only in numbers, not improvisation. But Thompson had violated that expectation. He had thought like a German commander, then struck like a ghost. One prisoner described it as if the trees had opened fire. Another claimed to have heard whistling, which might have been a delayed memory of the shells or just the wind in the woods. Trees distorted by fear. When American forces moved in to clear the road hours later, what they found stunned even hardened veterans. The wreckage looked like the aftermath of a coordinated airstrike. Vehicles stacked like dominoes, burned-out frames fused together by heat. Frozen corpses sprawled across the snow, some still clutching rifles. Trees splintered like toothpicks, tracks bent sideways, dug deep into the dirt. But above all, what was missing, what made it so strange, was the absence of American dead. There were none, because there had only ever been one gunner. From that day forward, survivors from that German column would refer to the incident by a single phrase: Die Geister Battery, the Ghost Battery. Disobedience or brilliance. For 48 hours, Ray Thompson expected to be arrested. After the shooting stopped, after the smoke cleared and the Germans either fled or burned, he sat inside the M10, motionless. His loader offered him a sip from a canteen. He didn't respond. The adrenaline had drained. Now came the dread. They had disobeyed direct orders. They had fired without permission. And regardless of how many tanks were burning, the military had rules. Back at battalion headquarters, Thompson filed his report. His commanding officer, Captain Langston from Pittsburgh, read it without saying a word. He flipped through the pages. Thompson sketches, range estimates, the diagram of the firing sequence's face, a mixture of anger and disbelief. You know, Langston finally said, if this had gone wrong, if even one of those was friendly fire. Thompson nodded. He didn't make excuses. I knew what I saw, he said simply. Langston stared at him, then exhaled. No one authorized this, Thompson. You understand that? I do. Langston didn't reprimand him. Not yet. Go get some rest. I've got to send this upstairs. Upstairs meant division command, which meant scrutiny, which often meant punishment testily for enlisted men who acted outside protocol. Thompson returned to his crew. They were quiet too. No back-patting, no celebration. They were all waiting for the hammer to fall. But it didn't. Not immediately. Because something else happened first. The scouts from the 1001st Airborne arrived 2 days later, faces hollow, eyes red from sleepless nights. They had expected to find that forest road crawling with armor. Instead, they found twisted German wreckage. They asked which unit took this out. Langston said, it wasn't a unit. It was one gunner. Word spread faster than orders. In mess tents, in supply lines. Across battalion radios, people began talking about the guy from Kansas who took out a Panzer column by himself. Some exaggerated, said it was 10 tanks, said he used 5 shells. Said he bounced shots like a trick pool player. But in the middle of the legend forming, the official investigation began. Division intelligence reviewed Thompson's field notes, interviewed the crew, even tried to confirm radio logs. They couldn't prove disobedience because there was no clear record of orders received. The lines had been jammed. What they could confirm was the kill count: 7 vehicles destroyed. For more disabled, 0 American casualties. And 1 key objective Novels North Road held. 1 airborne unit under siege reconnected to supply lines. And 1 decision, made in silence, had kept that corridor open. Langston expected a reprimand, but what came instead was something unusual. The division commander said, don't put this in the official briefing. Not yet. But tell your gunner we'll be watching his work. Thompson didn't receive a medal. Not then. But he wasn't court-martialed either. In fact, he was quietly assigned to train other gunners, teaching them how to disable convoys through sequence rather than brute force. No one said the word hero, but he was asked to diagram his decisions. And his notes were sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. To the U.S. Army Artillery School. That's when it hit him. They hadn't just forgiven what he did. They were studying it. Weeks later, Langston approached him. I was ready to report you, he said. But then I read that line in your notebook, the one about controlled collapse. What did you mean by that? Thompson replied, when you pull one stone from a wall, The rest falls if you know where to pull. L. Langston smiled. Well, next time you decide to knock down a wall, just give me a little warning. Thompson didn't smile back. To him, it wasn't victory, it was calculation, necessity. He knew it could have gone the other way. But war doesn't always punish disobedience. Sometimes, it learns from it. Ray Thompson never asked to be remembered. After the war, he went home to Kansas, married Helen, and opened a repair shop. He fixed tractors, built silos, and taught his son geometry by drawing angles in the dirt. He never called himself a hero, but others did. Years later, the Army quietly began teaching asymmetrical engagement, sequencing, a fancy term for a simple idea. Don't aim for the front, aim for the collapse. The case study they used came from Neville, Belgium. It showed maps, wreckage patterns, firing angles, but no names. Still, students at Fort Sill, and later, Fort Benning studied it because it worked, because it saved lives, because it changed what one gunner could do, not through firepower, but through logic, through geometry, through a willingness to act when orders fall silent. Decades later, a historian found the original report. He tracked down Thompson, now in his 80s, quiet and slightly deaf, living with his wife and a cat named Murphy. He asked about that day. Thompson said, "I remember the trees. I remember how still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." He didn't speak of victory or regret, just precision and necessity. When asked why he didn't wait for orders, he replied, "Because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." He paused, then added, "I didn't break the rules. I just stepped past them for a minute long enough to do what had to be done." That answer never made it into history books, but it stayed with the historian. Ray Thompson didn't win the war, but he saved a road, a column, a moment. And in war, sometimes that's everything. He reminded the Army that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it calculates, and sometimes it pulls the trigger not out of defiance, but out of duty. One gunner, one decision, one pattern, and an entire German column brought to its knees.